Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me again today. You are listening to The Account with a news report for day 352 on the war in Ukraine. Before we start the report, I will go over some of the interesting updates for day 351, so please skip this part if you are not interested. After, we will go over the latest Russian missile attack on Ukraine. The rest of the news updates are grouped into the usual situation inside Ukraine, the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, and the international developments. And now the updates for day 351. The expected large offensive of Russian troops on the border of the Luhansk and Kharkiv regions of Ukraine has begun. According to the findings of the Institute for the Study of War, based on open sources, Russian forces have regained the initiative in Ukraine and have begun a major offensive in Luhansk Oblast. The researchers noted that the start of the offensive is evidenced by the involvement of at least 3 large Russian divisions in offensive operations in this area. Yesterday, the Ukrainska Pravda published an article discussing the hottest spots on Ukraine's fronts, where Russia's attacks are the most acutely felt now, and the possible scenarios for Russia's further offensive operations. Ukroboronprom has started a joint venture with an unnamed NATO country for ammunition production. The Berdyansk City Military Administration claims that during the explosions on February 8th, a military airfield was hit and 100 Russian soldiers were killed. Russia reportedly lost half of its tank force. CNN cited data provided by the Oryx monitoring group. The German Rheinmetall company is ready to provide Ukraine with a cutting-edge Panther tank should the federal government approve. The first BMP-T Terminator was destroyed in Ukraine. Please keep in mind that these are the old T-72-based models and not the one based on the new Armata platform. President Zelensky has visited the EU Parliament in Brussels and was greeted by EU leaders. According to Zelensky, several European leaders expressed readiness to supply Ukraine with fighter jets. And before we start the regular report, first the flashpoints along the front. Kupiansk. Things are heating up in this direction. The Russian Ministry of Defense claims Dvorichne is captured. Ukraine reported repelled attacks around Ryanivka and Maziutivka. Crimea. Heavy battles are raging around Crimea, especially Dibrova. Russia has sent its VDV units to this area and the battles are brutal. Bakhmut. Ukraine reported repelled attacks around Krasnahora, Bakhmut and Ivanivske. Complex battles are taking place in the Bakhmut region and dozens of combat clashes are taking place per day. But the occupiers have not managed to cut off the supply routes of the armed forces yet. This was announced by the spokesman of the Eastern Group of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. To start the news segment, the updates on the latest Russian missile attack. Russia once again launched a massive missile attack on Ukraine today. This Liga.net article has the timeline for the main attack. The initial attack started early in the morning around 4 a.m. Russia fired 35 S-300 missiles at Kharkiv and Zaporizhia. Later, Russia launched another mass missile strike at Ukraine. Out of 71 cruise missiles, 61 were intercepted, Valery Zaluzhny, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, reported. Overall, he claimed 106 missiles and 7 drones were fired at Ukraine. His statement was made at 12 p.m. Kyiv time. Later in the evening, another attack wave was reported. This time, Russian forces used Shahed drones. Valery Zaluzhny also reported that Ukraine tracked 2 Kalibr cruise missiles entering Romanian and Moldovan airspace. The spokesperson for the Air Force Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Yuri Inat, repeated the claim. While Romania denied the claim and said the missile flew 35 kilometers from its airspace, Moldova summoned the Russian ambassador to protest the violation of Moldovan airspace. The attack once again targeted critical infrastructure across Ukraine. Especially energy infrastructure was damaged, including 4 DTEC thermal power plants. President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his evening address that there have been casualties among civilians, but so far no number was reported. He also said, "These missiles are a challenge to NATO and collective security. This is terror that can and must be stopped. The world must stop it. Now a look at all the minor news out of Ukraine. Ukraine is preparing to use British long-range missiles promised by British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to strike temporarily occupied Crimea. When employing the US-supplied HIMARS on the battlefield, the armed forces of Ukraine use target coordinates provided by the Pentagon or US allies. According to sources, Ukrainian troops almost never launch HIMARS without specific coordinates provided by the American partners. The National Security and Defense Council Secretary Oleksiy Danilov believes Russia will launch a major cyber attack as part of its supposed imminent major offensive in Ukraine. Ukraine's National Guard released a statement giving a step-by-step update on the creation of Offensive Guard and the training its members will go through. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. A resident of Mariupol has released photos of the destroyed city. It is quite the long article, so please check the photos out in detail later. According to Petro Andriuschenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, Russian military equipment was seen moving through Mariupol towards the east of Ukraine, likely to safer storage points. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. Moscow is planning to conduct a big rally concert for the so-called Defenders' Day at the Luzhniki Stadium with the participation of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The event is to take place on February 22nd, whereas the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started on February 24th last year. Up to 200,000 people are expected to attend. TikTok has revealed a Russian disinformation network disseminating propaganda about Moscow's full-scale war against Ukraine. The network targeted over 100,000 European users over the summer of 2022. Around 1,700 accounts masquerading as local users but based in Russia propagated anti-Ukrainian narratives to people in Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. According to the report, the accounts garnered 133,564 followers between July and September 2022. Russian President Vladimir Putin is set to deliver a speech to the Federal Assembly, the country's two-chamber parliament, on February 21st, ahead of the one-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, according to the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. French President Emmanuel Macron warned on Friday that even if Ukraine's European allies decided to send fighter jets to Kyiv, they could not be delivered in the coming weeks. "I don't rule anything out, but it doesn't meet today's requirements," Macron said. Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, has handed over lists of necessary weapons regarding new arms supply during a meeting with EU leaders on Thursday. Ukraine's requests were adjusted to the respective military reserves of the EU member states. This was intended to increase the pressure on individual states to provide more assistance to counter Russian aggression. Moldova's pro-EU government has collectively resigned today, yielding to months of pressure from Russia. The Moldovan government has long accused Russia, which bases soldiers in the breakaway region of Transnistria in the east, of stirring unrest in the country, including protests in the capital. The Moldovan parliament, meanwhile, has passed a law on separatism, targeting the breakaway territory of Transnistria. The entire high echelon of the Transnistrian government would be subjected to criminal prosecution. The law has yet to be signed by Moldovan President Maia Sandu. And now for the intelligence report segment, starting with the UK Ministry of Defence. Since February 7, 2023, Russian forces have likely made tactical gains in two key sectors. On the northern outskirts of the Donbas town of Bakhmut, Wagner Group forces have pushed 2 to 3 kilometers further west, controlling countryside near the MO3 main route into the town. Russian forces increasingly dominate the northern approaches to Bakhmut. To the south, Russian units have made advances around the western edge of the town of Vuhledar, where they relaunched offensive operations in late January 2023. However, Russian units have likely suffered particularly heavy casualties around Vuhledar, as inexperienced units have been committed. Russian troops likely fled and abandoned at least 30 mostly intact armored vehicles in a single incident after a failed assault. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. Russia is preparing its defense industry for a protracted war with Ukraine, but is trying to avoid a wider mobilization of the civilian economy and hide the extent of military equipment losses in every possible way. Russian President Vladimir Putin met with his supervisory board of the Agency for Strategic Initiatives and instructed the agency to support federal subjects in developing the production of unmanned aircraft systems. On the same day, Russian Deputy Chair of the Security Council Dmitry Medvedev encouraged Russian production of modern tanks to counter Western assistance in Ukraine. On February 9th, Russia's Wagner mercenary group claimed to have stopped recruiting prisoners to fight alongside Russian forces in Ukraine. The institute said that Wagner Group will likely continue to recruit from prisons, albeit in a much more limited capacity, which indicates the decrease of Russia's military reliance on the group. According to Dutch open source group Oryx, Russian forces have lost 1,012 destroyed tanks in Ukraine, with an additional 546 tanks captured by Ukrainian forces. Oryx reported that these combined losses represent roughly half the tanks that Russian forces committed to Ukraine at the start of the invasion. The Russian military needs to quickly replenish these tank losses to maintain the ability to conduct large-scale mechanized maneuver warfare ahead of a likely increased pace of offensive operations in eastern Ukraine. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. The Russian Federation launched more than 100 missiles during another massive missile attack on the territory of our country. According to preliminary information, the enemy used 29 S-300 anti-aircraft guided missiles and 71 air and sea-based cruise missiles. 61 cruise missiles were destroyed by our defenders. In addition, the invaders carried out 12 airstrikes, 2 of which were carried out by Shahed 136 UAVs, in particular on civilian infrastructure. In the village of Zalysny Port of the temporarily occupied territory of the Kherson Oblast, the Russian invaders are trying to carry out passporting of the local population. For this purpose, the passport office was moved from the village of Hola Pristan to the village. Given the fact that there is no queue of people wishing to obtain Russian citizenship, the occupiers promise a monetary reward to those who agree. In order to limit access to information of Ukrainian citizens in the temporarily occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, the mobile operators Phoenix and MKS have been turning off mobile internet for users since February 11th. And that concludes today's report. Should you be interested in any of the articles I mentioned, I included links to them in the description as usual. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.